Hey dreamers, welcome back to the world of Tana Dreams. Today I'm going to share 37 tips that have really helped me as a beginner watercolor artist. I have only been really painting with watercolors for about 6 months as of the date of this video's recording, so I still consider myself new to the game. Still, I want to share some tips, tricks, and practices that have really helped me improve and get me off the ground to hopefully help you out if you're new to watercolors as well. I want to say though that I'm not taking credit for all these tips. I'm sure other artists have shared these tips, or at least most of them, but I do want to compile them here because of how helpful they are. I'll link a few other videos that really helped me in the description as well. I want you to have as many resources as possible. Otherwise, here we go. These first tips are for if you want to do line art for your watercolor paintings using fine liner pens. Tip number 1, use waterproof fineliners for your line art. When you do line art, always verify that your fine liner pens are indeed waterproof. The last thing you ever want is your line art to melt away after you apply watercolors. You can test the fine liner ink by scribbling them down and then applying some watercolors. Pigma Micron pens are waterproof. I am just Mr. Impatient and didn't give them enough time to dry. Which leads me to tip number 2. Always allow your line art ink to dry. Always give your fine line pens at least a few minutes to dry before applying any water. A little bit of patience always goes a long way. Tip number 3. Use watercolor or mixed media canvases. Whenever you work with watercolors, please always use watercolor paper or at least a mixed media paper. Your canvas needs to be able to retain water and the pigments. Regular sketch or printer paper will usually melt and degrade after application of water. Tip number 4. Skip the sketch phase? Go for it. If you can skip the sketch, such as through using a lighting board, or if you're comfortable with freehand drawing, go for it. That way you don't have to worry about erasing the initial sketch layers, damaging the canvas, and all that. Keep in mind that the same canvas that you do your sketch layer will be the same canvas of your final piece. The following tips are for if you do a sketch layer on your canvas. I won't be showing that here on camera, so you will have to use the audio for these. Tip number 5, preserve your canvas. Go light on your sketch layers. I find that sketching too hard on your canvas can damage it, especially if you're using a cheaper watercolor paper. So if you sketch, don't press too hard, just enough for you to see the sketch but also for you to easily erase it. Tip number 6, always erase your sketch layer. Always erase your sketch layer before you apply your watercolors, because after you apply the watercolors, that sketch is sealed there for good. Tip number 7, use kneaded erasers. Use a kneaded putty eraser to erase your sketch. Do you remember how those blocky erasers used to rip up your homework and leave a lot of dust? We don't want that to happen to your watercolor canvas, do we? Tip number 8, please take breaks. The moment you feel tired, have an itch for a stretch break, or even to take a quick walk, please go for it. The last thing we want is for your art to make you feel fatigued or frustrated. Tip number 9. This is more of a tip for acquiring a limited watercolor palette. A great watercolor palette will usually have at least 2 hues of primary colors. For example, ultramarine is a really good staple for many colors that need mixing. You can get many great color combos from using at least 2 hues of the primary colors alone. Plus, using a limited watercolor palette will really help you with mixing colors and color theory. Tip number 10, swatch. Always swatch or test your watercolors. It's always a great idea to have a clear picture of what you're putting on your canvas before it's too late. I usually do swatching on mixed media sketch paper or scraps of cheap watercolor paper. Tip number 11, mixing. Always practice your watercolor mixing, especially if you're working with a limited watercolor set. Instead of using the secondary colors offered in the color sets, such as oranges and greens, you can get more organic hues by mixing ultramarines with lemon yellows and all that. Tip number 12, 2 jars of water. Always have 2 jars or cups of water when you paint with watercolors. One to clean the brush and the other to wet your watercolors and to mix. The cleaner the water, the purer and more vibrant your watercolors will be. Tip number 13. Paint features that are far away from each other. To avoid watercolors from bleeding with each other, paint features far away from each other to allow the first one to dry. Bleeding mainly occurs when one wet patch touches another wet patch, so let's keep those 2 wet patches far away from each other. Tip number 14. Keep a paper towel or a cloth nearby. Always have 1 or 2 sheets of paper towels or disposable cloths nearby, not only to clean your watercolor brush, but also to dry your brush when you need it. Tip number 15, keeping your paintbrush dry. The wetter your paintbrush, the less accurate the strokes will be. So if there's a lot of excess water on your watercolor brush, tap it against your paper towel or cloth to remove that excess water. Tip number 16, keep your workstation clean. The moment you don't need a piece of equipment, put it away. The less clutter, the better. Hey Brandon, way to go on front of the camera in your pajamas. Shut up, Monty. It was a lazy Sunday afternoon when I filmed this, okay? Tip number 17, use a hairdryer. If you want to make your canvas dry faster, use a hairdryer. I recommend starting it at low to make sure your water doesn't splatter, and then make it stronger or hotter as you need. Tip number 18, layering. If a layer of watercolor seems too thin or not strong enough, the key is to add another layer and it will become much stronger. More professional watercolors should have a stronger pigment, but this is the workaround for student grade or cheaper watercolor sets. Tip number 19, smaller brushes. To get more precise strokes, or if you're just painting a very designated spot, use smaller brushes to get more accurate, intricate details done. Think about it, smaller spots, smaller brushes. Tip number 20, stray spots. If you accidentally have any stray spots of watercolor, you can fix it. Just use some clear water and brush it to wake it back up. Then use your cloth or paper towel to pat it away. Tip number 21, how do I know it's dry? Here's a super easy way to tell if a paint is still wet. Look at the side with a light source, preferably the sun. If you see a reflective layer, that means the paint is still wet. A dry layer will have a dull look in comparison. Tip number 22, the wet on wet technique. If you want to get a gradient effect, an easy way is to use the wet on wet technique, meaning to put more layers of paint while the initial one is still wet. Here, I'm making one side of the stump darker than the other by not only pushing the pigments to one side, but adding a darker pigment to the darker side. Tip number 23, masking fluid. If you want to keep a certain feature of your painting white or free of paint, masking fluid makes things so much easier. In a nutshell, it's a liquid that dries pretty rubbery and it prevents watercolor from touching the canvas due to the protective layer. Tip number 24, put it on thin. If you're using a cheap canvas, masking fluid can be strong enough to actually rip the canvas when you remove it. This has happened to me on several occasions and I had to dispose of the entire piece. Therefore, the workaround for this is just to apply a thin layer, as that should suffice. Tip number 25, use a cotton swab for application. Regarding my previous tip, I find using a paintbrush to apply the masking fluid usually adds too much fluid, so a cotton swab will give a light and precise application of the masking fluid, which is what we want if we're using a cheaper canvas. Tip number 26, smoother layers, work quickly. If you want a smoother, flatter layer of watercolor, you do have to work pretty quickly. You get those splotches when the edges of the watercolors begin collecting and drying, so you have to quickly paint and move the watercolors around to get everything in one layer before it dries. Unfortunately, cheaper watercolors tend to dry chalkier, so you do have to spend a little more to get a cleaner result. Tip number 27, use light saturation for the background. When painting backgrounds, go easy on the saturation. Too much saturation will detract attention from the focal point, which is the main focus of the piece. So go easy on the background when you apply the first layer because you can just add another layer if it's too dull or light. Tip number 28, how to remove masking fluid. To remove masking fluid, use the fleshy part of your finger and rub off the rubbery layer quickly. It will come off like dust. Tip number 29, substitute pink. If your paint set doesn't contain a pink or a hot pink, don't mix the hues of red with white as that usually will make the paint opaque. Just add more water to your red pigments until you get a light pinkish layer that will be transparent upon application. Tip number 30, how to get rid of patchy edges. If you're trying to get smooth layers of watercolor and you're still getting patchy edges from leaving the watercolors to dry, just wake it back up with water and move it around. That will help the layer become smooth again. Tip number 31, hard shading. To get a harder shading with watercolors, let the initial layer completely dry and then apply the second layer. Work quickly and don't scrub too hard because you could wake the initial layer back up. Tip number 32, softer shading. To get a softer shading, just do the wet on wet method I mentioned earlier. To get a smoother gradient, just wet your brush, don't pick up any more pigment, and slowly shift the paint downwards. Tip number 33, using non-waterproof pens. If you want to use non-waterproof pens on your piece, apply it after you are completely done painting. We don't want to risk water making the ink run everywhere and destroying all your hard work, so apply it after you are completely done painting. Tip number 34. Take a picture of your artwork and then use a grayscale or monochromatic filter on it. That way you can see if all the values on your piece are the same or not. If you are able to see darker values, that is a good sign. If it all looks the same, it may mean you need to go back and use a darker value for some of your colors. Tip number 35. UV protection. Most beginner watercolors are not archival, meaning the colors will fade when exposed to sunlight. To protect your watercolors, spray a UV protective sealant. UV protective sealants are usually available at hobby and craft stores, but I got this one online. Tip number 36. Sign off. Always sign off your work. Your artwork is yours, so leaving your signature or a watermark will prevent those pesky art thieves from taking what's most precious from you. Tip number 37. Be proud of your piece. Even if you don't think your piece is perfect, that is okay. You took a big step by getting a project done. You learned, you practiced, and you still have a wonderful piece for your portfolio. Plus, you can apply what you learned into your next piece, which is great. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The world of Tana Dreams is full of art, creativity, and positivity, and I would love to see you here again. Have a wonderful rest of your day. May all your sweet dreams come true.